Welcome to today's event on the next 4 years, U.S. foreign policy, with myself, Perry Worldhouse Woke Distinguished Visiting Fellow, Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, and Perry Worldhouse Visiting Fellow from the Philadelphia Inquirer, Trudy Rubin, who I hope will join me on stage, as it were, now. Ambassador Vershbow has had a distinguished career as a U.S. diplomat, serving as U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs, Ambassador to Korea, Russia, and NATO, and as the first American to become Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Trudy Rubin is the Foreign Affairs columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer. She's twice been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Commentary and is the author of Willful Blindness, the Bush Administration in Iraq. She's covered major stories from China, Russia, and Ukraine, Pakistan, and Kashmir, all over the Middle East and Europe. We'll be talking about the most critical foreign policy and national security challenges facing the United States today and how they might play out over the next few months and in a Biden administration, including the immediate issues arising from the COVID-19 pandemic and re-engagement with international institutions, rebuilding alliances, great power competition, and all the like. So thanks so much, Trudy and Sandy, for joining us today. And I want to start by turning the floor over to Sandy to tell us what he thinks about the events of the last week and what he sees in the future of American foreign policy.
Well, thanks very much, Mike. And it's great to be here and to look ahead to what the next 4 years of foreign policy are going to bring. Let me start by giving my sense of how the world sees the results of our election. I think with the exception of Vladimir Putin and a few other authoritarian leaders, most of the world is relieved that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris have emerged victorious over Donald Trump, even if Donald Trump doesn't admit that yet. America's friends are reassured by Joe Biden's experience, his character, and his credentials as a true blue internationalist. Even those leaders who may have gotten the better of Trump and lament his defeat, I would include Xi Jinping, Kim Jong-un, Mohammed bin Salman in that group, they still may welcome the greater predictability that Biden will provide, if not his likely focus on human rights. Now, of course, our allies and partners know that there can't be a simple return to the way things were at the end of the Obama administration. The world has changed in many ways, and Trump's foreign policy record isn't entirely negative. But our friends are certainly hopeful that even with changed priorities, Biden will bring about a quick restoration of old-fashioned US leadership, a recommitment to democratic values, and renewed support for US alliances and multilateral cooperation. He's a great believer in alliances, and as someone who's worked at NATO, I'm very pleased by that. I think our allies and partners are also very happy to hear Biden promise that he's going to rejoin the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Accords, probably literally on day one, and that he's ready to extend the New START agreement with Russia for up to 5 years. They're also looking to the administration to jumpstart international cooperation to contain the pandemic, as well as climate change. And I think it's encouraging that the president-elect has already set up a panel on COVID-19. But before I sound too optimistic, let me say that our allies' hopes are going to be tempered by several factors, starting with the results of the elections themselves. Biden's victory, impressive as it was not accompanied by the expected blue wave. He defeated Trump, but not Trumpism, which is deeply entrenched in the Republican Party and in nearly half the US electorate, as we can see in the support for Trump's continued efforts to contest the results of the election. And barring a miracle in Georgia, Biden will not have control of the Senate, which will limit his options on domestic policy, where he'll certainly need congressional funding to implement even half of his ambitious social and economic agenda. He will have more freedom of maneuver on foreign policy and will benefit from a bipartisan consensus on many of the major issues, including the primacy of great power competition with Russia and China and the value of alliances. But there's still going to be pressure from within the Democratic Party to cut defense spending and pull back from a lot of overseas commitments, despite Biden's internationalist DNA. And of course, despite the goodwill toward Biden, there will be persistent doubts about American reliability, whether Biden can sustain his new policy direction when there's a real possibility that they'll all be repudiated in just 4 years' time by another president who dismisses alliances as bad deal for America and takes us back to America first and the world of conspiracy theories. So all these uncertainties could prompt many of our partners to hedge their bets, to look out for themselves, and not count on the United States over the next 4 years. It could mean continued calls from some of our European allies for more strategic autonomy from the US and NATO. But let me say that's not necessarily a bad thing. In transatlantic relations, there may be a basis for a more equal partnership with our allies in NATO and the European Union, in which the Europeans take more responsibility for security and stability in their own neighborhood, the Western Balkans, the former Soviet space, the Middle East and North Africa, allowing the US to devote more of its resources to the strategic competition with Russia and China. I think it's also encouraging that Biden has talked about embedding our foreign policy in a broader community or league of democracies, which would bring in Japan, South Korea, Australia, maybe India, together with our European allies in a kind of expanded G7 or some kind called the Democracy 10. And I'm glad Biden has promised to convene a summit of democracies during his first year. And many of his advisors have written favorably about a League of Democracies as the new organizing framework for US foreign policy. I think this would be a stronger base on which to manage relations with China, Russia, and other rivals and adversaries. And it could ultimately lead to a more multipolar West based on shared leadership and shared values. And that may be more in keeping with America's need to focus first and foremost on getting its own house in order, and with Europe's aspirations to finally become a geopolitical player and not just an economic power. So there's some thoughts on the overall landscape, but I very much look forward to Trudy's perspective and to discussing the more concrete issues during our discussion today.
So Trudy, what do you think? Is it smooth sailing now that it seems like Biden is coming into power? You know, what's next for the United States?
I think that what we have seen since the election tells us as much about the struggles that Biden's going to have with foreign policy as it does about the struggles to get President Trump to recognize that President-elect Biden has actually won the election. The central effort by President-elect Biden to embed policy in a community of democracies depends to a large extent on whether he can show both our allies and our adversaries that the United States is still a functional democracy. Obviously, US leadership, or the image of US leadership, has taken a big hit, not only from President Trump's withdrawal from that role and personalizing of of leadership, but from the fact that it looks as if the United States is struggling to uphold and practice the very principles that underlie our constitutional system. And China and Russia certainly look at that. And many of you in the audience will have read articles quoting Chinese leaders and authors on American decline. So I think that how this election is settled and whether or not President-elect Biden has any control over Congress are going to have a huge effect on how much the United States can do to shape a policy of competition with China, to prevent Russian meddling way beyond elections, and even to convince our allies, as Sandy said, that we are capable of re-exerting the leadership that they really are looking for. You have to take into account that Chancellor Merkel is almost on her way out, that President Macron only has a little more than a year before he has to start campaigning. So if there's going to be a closer attempt by allies, democratic allies, to deal with China and Russia, the United States is going to have to take the lead. And if we are weakened at home and Joe Biden can't get the help from Congress that he is going to need in fighting COVID, in trying to set up what his people are describing as a new policy for the middle class, in cooperating with allies on climate change, he will need Congress, congressional funding, and public support for all of these. And it's going to be very difficult if he is fighting tooth and nail to prevent a revanchism, even with Trump out of the White House, from undercutting his capabilities. I think that you can see that just in terms of COVID. As was mentioned, he set up a task force on COVID, and this is very promising. But in order to move ahead with a comprehensive COVID strategy, finally, for this country, which is imperative both to show the world that Biden is capable, that the United States has not lost its competence, and that we can provide value to international efforts on COVID. In order to do all that, he has to have congressional and public support. And if he's totally preoccupied with fighting, sniping from Trump TV, Fox TV, and can't reach the public, that's going to exemplify American weakness at home that undercuts us abroad. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Trudy. I want to start in terms of questions with something that happened yesterday that I think is generated a lot of debate, and that is the why do we say abrupt termination on Twitter of Secretary of Defense Esper. And more broadly, given the why do we say the unusual character in some ways that this transition might take, with GSA not yet approving funds for a Biden transition, et cetera. What do you see specifically over the next, I guess, one, how worried are you about the Esper firing and what it means? And then what do you, any particular sort of fears over the next couple of months? Or is this basically like DC insider concern, but not something, we really need to worry about? I don't know who wants to go first. Trudy, you look like you want to jump in. So Trudy, you want to go Trudy, then Sandy.
The answer is we don't know. But if you want to look at the worst case scenario, which it seems that we always have to do, although hopefully we don't go there, we know that Esper was on Trump's hit list because he refused to use US military to break up demonstrations in various cities, peaceful demonstrations. And we saw the demonstration in Lafayette Square that caused a lot of angst at the Pentagon because Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Milley, went out there in uniform and then later apologized. So you have to ask, is he getting rid of Esper because he might want to use troops if there are demonstrations, whether over refusal to accept defeat or even peaceful demonstrations on race? So who knows what else before January 20th? That's number one. As you know, there are also rumors that he wants to get rid of Gina Haspel, the head of the CIA, and also Andrew McCabe, FBI chief. That's also worrying.
Christopher Wray. Christopher Wray, not Andrew McCabe.
Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah.
You
sorry, Christopher Wray. There's so many of them being, off with their heads that you begin to roll them into a ball. But the point being, does he want to go after his enemies before he leaves and have them dig up cherry-picked dirt? Or is there something more nefarious at hand? But bottom line, I think it undercuts Biden from the get-go. And it also undercuts his ability to get started now on dealing with the COVID surge.
Sandy?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think this may be more payback for Esper's betrayal in not being willing to do everything Trump wanted with US troops against the demonstrations. And that may be why he's going to axe Gina Haspel and Christopher Wray. But what worries me is, and I was worried about this even before these firings, that during this transition period, some of our adversaries might take advantage of the situation to launch some kind of provocation, whether it's the Chinese putting additional pressure on Taiwan. I don't think they'll invade Taiwan, although you have to be ready for that too. The Russians might try to provoke some new internal strife using their disinformation and propaganda. The Iranians might launch some attacks through their militias in Iraq against our embassy again, which could precipitate a lashing back by Trump. The Russians could do something to the Ukrainians. There's lots of potential crises, and getting rid of some of the leaders of our national security apparatus makes us inevitably less prepared, less able to fully assess and make the right judgments in dealing with potential provocations like that. So that's doing something potentially quite harmful to the security of the nation even now. And it also will handicap the standing up of a strong Defense Department and intelligence community by Biden when he gets to that point. So it's quite dangerous, and it just shows the contempt that Trump still has for our basic institutions and for the deep state, and that he's not going to stop until noon on January 20th. He can do a hell of a lot of damage between now and then.
A sobering note, but let's shift to talk about something you mentioned that you have a lot of experience with, in particular, Sandy, that being Russia. And one might say that Russia has kind of been living rent-free in our heads over the last 4 years during the Trump administration. And two-part question here for you and Trudy. One is, what do you think Putin thinks about these election results? Like, was this his sort of preferred scenario? Was he hoping for another 4 years of Trump? And then second, what does American strategy toward Russia look like in some ways? Once there isn't a reset of sorts, probably, I mean, forget the button, but once there's a reset of sorts back to what I think was a relatively bipartisan American foreign policy toward Russia prior to the Trump administration.
And I think there still is a bipartisan policy if you go to the Congress. It was just the White House was on a different planet when it came to Russia. But I think your first question about Putin's desired scenario, I don't think he felt quite as strongly about who's the preferred winner this time than in 2016, because Trump didn't deliver the concessions, the sweeping problems like Ukraine under the rug that Putin may have hoped for. And the administration maintained a fairly robust policy on Russia, even though it seemed completely out of tune with the president of the United States. But that being said, Trump did deliver kind of chaos, confusion, weakening of American values and democratic institutions, weakening of NATO, divisions across the Atlantic. So in that sense, he gained a lot in terms of Russia's traditional agenda. And so I think he's probably not looking optimistically at having to deal with a Biden administration. The Democrats clearly have become hardliners on Russia, and
yeah, it's sort of remarkable looking at the poll data on what self-described Democrats say about Russia.
The lines crossed somewhere in the last 5 or 10 years, and so and Biden will emphasize human rights. I think he has been associated with strong support for Ukraine, will continue the military assistance, may even beef it up. I think he's already spoken out on the potential Russian suppression of the popular rebellion that's unfolding in Belarus. So most observers think that Putin sees a Biden presidency as nothing but trouble and headaches, with the prospects of improvement in relations being pretty dim. I don't think Biden is looking for a sort of all-out confrontation with Moscow. I think he'll stand by sort of our principled stance on the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. He's not going to throw Ukraine under the bus the way Trump was prepared to do and led to his impeachment. But he is interested in arms control. He does want to kind of lower the temperature in the competition, prevent dangerous military incidents from spinning out of control. So I think he'll go back to the Cold War toolbox, not only extending the New START agreement, but seeking a follow-on agreement that could expand the scope to cover other nuclear weapons, which is something the Trump administration has at least talked about. But doing so, working more closely with our allies, because I think a united front with our allies is the best way to deal with a still aggressive and revisionist Russia. What Biden has written in some of the articles that he's put out over the last year, and looking at his speeches at the Munich Security Conference over the years, he's definitely going to be firm. He's not going to tolerate sort of further Russian encroachment on its neighbors, as they've done in Ukraine. But ready to engage if there's some specific areas where Russia is prepared to be constructive, maybe on North Korean nuclear issues, or some successor to the JCPOA on Iran, where I think Russia was helpful in arriving at the original agreement and wants to be seen at the top table as having a role in these kinds of international issues. So there may be at least some isolated areas for cooperation, even if the overall relationship remains fairly frosty for the foreseeable future.
Drew, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I agree with what Sandy has said. I think it would be very important to have a president who doesn't equivocate on whether he supports Article 5 in our NATO position, a president who mentions the word Navalny, as in the Russian opposition leader who was poisoned in Siberia and is recuperating in Berlin, but has pledged to go back to Moscow. So I think in that sense, it will be good to have a clarification, to have a president who doesn't talk about inviting Putin to the G7 and expanding it again to the G8. I think at least on that level, the positions will be clear. But again, obviously, Putin will be waiting to see if he can pick at American sores. And so we swing back again to whether Trump will provide the open wounds, which Russia can try to exacerbate.
So a question that just came up in the chat that I think is interesting. I was going to ask something like this anyways, in a way, is that the Trump administration national security strategy laid out the prominence of great power competition as an endemic feature, some ways, of the security environment that the United States faces, pointing to China and Russia. And this was seen in some ways as a shift from the focus on places like Afghanistan, counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, those sorts of operations over the last few decades, since 9/11. We now have both the global pandemic from COVID-19, as well as climate change. Not that climate change wasn't on the table before, but I would say has been featured increasingly prominently as the evidence has become even clearer that human-induced climate change is permanently altering our world. To what extent do you think a Biden administration is likely to continue this emphasis on great power competition versus shift to more of an emphasis on transnational threats? Or should we not think about these as binaries? Or is it really that dealing with these kinds of challenges requires both of those things?
I don't think you can avoid great power competition. And I think you see that in a lot of the writings by people like Jake Sullivan, who was Biden's national security advisor, and before that, head of policy planning at State. The Biden people talk about managed competition. And what I find very interesting is that the Biden position, or the Biden team position, on managed competition with China depends very heavily, again, on what can be achieved domestically. Because one of the main points that Jake Sullivan has made in several articles that he's written is that in order to compete with China, we have to increase at home US investment in infrastructure, technology, innovation, and education. And Sullivan talks about good debt and bad debt and makes the point that it is essential to spend money on those areas that I just mentioned, while tax breaks for the rich is running up bad debt. Now, what's so important about that in great power competition is, as we all know, that China is steaming ahead on technology advances, and the United States doesn't do enough private R&D to keep up and keep ahead. And so in order to be in the game, we don't have a Huawei. In order to be in the game, there has to be some kind of industrial policy, words that before everyone kept away from. Now I think the Democrats will embrace, and the question is whether the Republicans will fight against it. But in order to compete in this managed competition that is central in Biden foreign policy with China, we are going to have some kind of coordinated policy at the top on key areas. And the question is whether we can get there in this political environment.
Yeah, I agree with everything Trudy just said. I think that this may be an area where on the issues you just raised regarding innovation and new technology, where there should be some common ground and a possibility of getting at least some funding out of a Republican-controlled Senate, because not letting China win the race to be the master of these new technologies, which it's trying to do under its China 2025 plan, requires us to find ways to boost at least basic research, even if Republicans draw the line at getting into applied research and actually the maximum industrial policy. But I think more broadly, Biden will I think continue this basic paradigm of great power competition, even if they may choose some different terminology to put their own brand on it. But of course, this consensus between the parties on great power competition is not, it's broader than it is deep. I think there's many different interpretations. And I think Biden is likely to promote an approach which is first of all grounded in working with allies, as everything else that he's going to be doing, and trying to avoid an all-out confrontation with China, which I think will make it easier to bring allies along to work with us, because the allies such as Korea and Japan are very concerned about getting sort of sucked into the middle of a all-out confrontation, and they don't want to have to make a binary choice between Washington or Beijing. But I think that Biden will emphasize enough, readiness to engage with China, work with them on those transnational threats that do have some prospect for common ground. A unified approach can perhaps get them to be less extreme in their sharp trade practices and encourage them to come back into compliance with some of the rules of a reformed WTO, which I think will be one of Biden's priorities. So it'll be kind of more managed competition, I think may be a good way to describe it. Cooperate where we can, but recognize that there is a race for these new technologies that we have to join and ultimately win. And there are some geopolitical threats from China where we do have to stand up and deter provocative behavior, not least in terms of threats to Taiwan. But I think working with allies, it's likely to come out as a kind of a middle of the road version of great power competition. And that may be the right choice.
And I'd say an intersection between the two of those things is there's been a bunch of discussion about, U.S. work with allies and partners specifically in the area of emerging technologies, thinking about the notion of alliances of free societies as a way to collaborate on research and development and technological innovation to counter the size of China's market in a way. So building closer relations with allies and partners may have a positive impact, a positive spillover into the technology sphere as well.
That's going to be tricky because of the emphasis on bringing back jobs, Buy American, which is very pronounced in Biden's campaign. Ideally, it would be better to talk about buying from within the democratic community, reduce dependence on China, but we're all in this together. But that may be asking too much.
So we have a question in the chat that asks about an area. I mean, I don't know if I'm sure you both remember, but early in the Trump administration, it was all about North Korea. The risk of war. People were very concerned about the risk of war with North Korea. Kim. Trump met his good friend Kim, and they had a chat. What do you see on the Korean Peninsula over the next 4 years? In particular, are we back to normal essentially, where North Korea has nuclear weapons and there's not really a whole lot we can do about it, and there's sort of a cold peace there, or is there any prospect for movement? Where are we now? Now 3 years or so, almost 4 years after the sort of first North Korea crisis during the Trump administration.
Yeah, well, this is an area where Trump may have actually had a real opportunity when he had his first summit meeting with Kim Jong-un, but he kind of squandered whatever potential there was to actually achieve some kind of de-escalation in the relationship and progress towards denuclearization, which still has to be the sine qua non of any approach to North Korea. And as a result, we have a North Korea with more and more nuclear weapons, anywhere from 50 to 60 warheads. Just displayed a fairly large intercontinental ballistic missile, which might have the capacity to have multiple warheads, confounding our ballistic missile defenses. And they may even, as they've done with previous administrations, start the relationship off with some provocations, literally on or shortly after Inauguration Day, including breaking their moratorium on nuclear tests and long-range ballistic missile tests. So it's a volatile situation, and Trump has made it harder to manage because of his frictions with the South Korean government over defense burden sharing, where he's made extravagant demands for a 5-fold increase in the annual offset payment that the South Koreans provide, and even threatening unilateral withdrawals of US troops, which only emboldens North Korea to dig in any future negotiations. So the South Koreans are hopeful that it will be returned to a somewhat more balanced approach, which I think is the best way to manage the situation, to go back to a multilateral approach so that the North Koreans can't play China off against the US and other parties, except that denuclearization is going to be a process. We're not going to achieve it in one fell swoop, and that we're going to have to think realistically about sort of incrementally easing sanctions in order to coax the North Koreans to begin to freeze and dismantle some of their nuclear capabilities. But I think it would be a mistake to go back to the Obama policy of strategic patience. That yielded no progress. It's gotten worse under Trump. And I think we need a proactive policy, but working with allies, being prepared not to tolerate North Korea as an official nuclear weapon state, but to accept that denuclearization is going to take years to accomplish, even in the most optimistic scenario.
Trudy, you want to jump in here? Do you have a secret plan to fix things on the Korean Peninsula?
No, the problem is, in principle, I agree with Sandy, except in every sentence there's a checkmate, as we all know, because sadly, basically North Korea is pretty much a nuclear power. And from everything we have ever seen about Kim Jong-un, he believes that. So it's going to be extremely difficult to roll it back. I think, as Sandy said, it's essential that Biden make clear from the get-go that relationships with South Korea are going to be tight and relations with Japan are going to stay tight. But that still doesn't resolve the issue. And undoubtedly, Kim will test. And then what? Because as Sandy mentioned, going back to these endless negotiations, strategic patience is just a putting off the hard stuff policy. But it is very hard to see what leverage the allies are going to have on Kim Jong-un, especially with a very strained relationship between the US and China. And obviously, China will use this issue as a lever against Washington.
So we've got 250 people on from around the world, and several people now, like in the chat, in the Q&A, have asked us to play everybody's favorite parlor game after an election, which is who's going into the government. So I realize that you all may know actual things that you're, thus like not at liberty to say. So I suspect you may dance around this, but what are your thoughts on, how a President Biden might try to staff his administration in places like state and defense and the National Security Council, as he, seeks to, as the phrase in the transition website says, build back better?
I think the same group of names has been circulating, and I certainly have no inside knowledge that says they're all going to get cast aside and somebody else is going to get drawn in. Michelle Flournoy at Defense, maybe that's not carved in stone, but she is the name who comes up most frequently. And at State, Tony Blinken, who is one of the president-elect's closest advisors, Bill Burns, now the head of Carnegie, but before that, ambassador to everywhere, is often mentioned. And somewhere in that mix, perhaps the national security advisor is Jake Sullivan, who is truly brilliant. Susan Rice's name comes up. I don't know how serious a consideration she is. And those are the names one hears most frequently.
I don't have many other names. I think there's been talk of Wendy Sherman, who was in the lead on the Iran nuclear deal when she was a counselor at the State Department, could end up as ambassador to the UN, but Pete Buttigieg is sometimes mentioned as a candidate for that.
Everybody loves Mayor Pete right now.
Yeah. I mean, Susan Rice, I think they'll find some place for her, but I think with the Senate going Republican, or likely to go Republican, they'll be gun shy about a confirmation fight, even though she's been unjustly tainted by what she said about Benghazi. It's total BS, but that's the rap on her anyway. So there may be some effort to find a couple of places for Republicans to show bipartisanship, probably more likely on the domestic side. And the one name that Trudy didn't mention, who I think is a serious contender, is Senator Coons, Chris Coons, for Secretary of State.
Yeah, he's
clearly running hard for the job.
He's great, but as people have said about the wonderful Senator Chris Coons, he's terrific on foreign policy. He has said it himself. I've heard him say it. If I wasn't 5'2" and bald, jokingly, maybe I would have run for president. He is cogent and smart and in our circulation zone. But and I guess he would be replaceable with a Democrat. So that is always possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and of course, some people may decide to wait for the second round. Some people only last two and a half years in the job, so there may be a whole series of replacements down the road.
There often are, though perhaps not at the rate we've had them over the last few years.
Let's hope not.
So another question we've got in the chat, a couple different variants of this, asks about some parts of the world that we haven't touched on yet. And that one question specifically says, your comments are largely directed east and west. What about north and south? What will a Biden administration look like with regard to Latin America, and specifically Venezuela? do you see, say, will the Biden administration maybe try to ease sanctions on Venezuela, or will policy look like Trump, even if rhetoric is different? And then looking north, I mean, I'm not sure I've ever seen somebody happier on Twitter than Justin Trudeau, than the picture of Justin Trudeau sort of calling Biden. But, what's going to happen to American relations with Canada, which have been, a little frostier than normal over the last couple of years?
I can't say anything on Latin America since I don't have any special expertise on that. Although I must say that it would be hard to do worse on Venezuela. Assuredly, you will not have the needlessly insulting and alienating policy of our close ally, Canada. I find it interesting that Mexico, Lopez Obrador, still has not, maybe it happened today, but as one of the leaders holding back on congratulating the president-elect. He's had an actually surprisingly good relationship with Trump, but Canada, I'm sure that Trudeau is dancing in his living room. And north and south, of course, we haven't mentioned Middle East. Maybe nobody wants to talk about it.
Next question is actually going to be about the Middle East.
I'm not much of an expert on Latin America, but I think I can say that it's never received as much attention as at the presidential level as it probably deserves under most administrations. Apparently Biden, traveled there more often than most vice presidents, and certainly more than presidents. So perhaps he'll have a more active interest in helping them with some of the many problems that they face down there. But I think there's going to be this question of bandwidth. How much can a new administration do in terms of new innovation and new policy departures when it's, first of all, has to come to grips with COVID and with the getting out of the economic depression. So Latin America may get short shrift yet again. But the relationship with Canada, I think this is one of the areas where Trump did bequeath something positive, which is the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, the updated NAFTA. It wasn't as innovative as he advertised, but it definitely brought that agreement into the digital age and addressed some of the concerns on both sides of the aisle regarding labor. So it's a good basis on which to build bilateral relations. But I think the main engagement with Canada will be in the context of the G7 and NATO and sort of the global agenda more than the bilateral agenda.
So another question, shifting to the Middle East. Say, two parts here. There's the first part of the question is going to be about Saudi, and then the second question is going to be about Israel. A question in the chat says that President-elect Biden is committed to reassessing ties with Riyadh. I mean, maybe he does not want a giant orb or something, and says that his administration will undertake a strategic review of the U.S. bilateral relationship with Saudi Arabia. I would say for outsider, for those not involved in international politics, the closeness of America's ties with Saudi Arabia, given the character of that regime, has been puzzling, probably in many ways for decades. Is that actually going to change over the next 4 years? And then the second part of that question is, we've just had the Abraham Accords involving Israel. Do you see that getting rolled back in a Biden administration, or does that become the new status quo? Regardless, what do we see happening with America's relationship with Israel?
Well, let me just start by making a broader statement, because I think Biden has to reassess the situation in the region as a whole. It's very hard to separate out Israel and Saudi Arabia if you don't look at what Biden policy is going to be towards Iran. And of course, one of the reasons that Saudi Arabia was so hostile to the Obama administration and chummy with the Trump administration was because of the Iran issue and the split in the region. So as for Saudi Arabia itself, apart from whether or not the Biden administration can restart the JCPOA. And I think there are a lot of questions about that, which we can get into if another questioner is interested. I think there's no question that human rights issues will be raised. Whether the administration decides to really break with Saudi Arabia is another question. You can at least be frank with the Crown Prince about wanting an honest resolution of the Jamal Khashoggi issue, which has never been confronted, and also about the fact that many female human rights activists, as well as male, but leading activists of the women's driving movement are languishing in prison, some of them having been tortured. But my guess is that the first move on relations with Saudi Arabia would be to extricate the United States from the disastrous war in Yemen and try to facilitate a negotiated solution. Because that's one of the sore points with the relationship with Saudi Arabia. And that really, that is a humanitarian disaster that has to be brought to some kind of a close. You know, as for relations with Israel, you know, in private, Joe Biden was treated miserably by Netanyahu, humiliated on one of his trips there. And so obviously there will be no love lost. But beyond that, the question of what you do on the Palestinian issue is really almost unresolvable. The recognition by the UAE, the new Arab troika of recognition, and Sudan, it's not completed and may never be, but those will stay as is. But as far as Israel-Palestine, the chief negotiator on the Palestinian side just died today, Saeb Erekat, who has been working on this for decades. And the process is basically, for now, totally moribund. So the question is whether Biden will do anything on settlements, which continue to make it, you know, below zero, that you can ever negotiate for any kind of Palestinian entity or state. And my guess is that with so much else on his plate, as you mentioned, that issue will somehow be finessed as the Biden administration tries to focus on what to do about Iran and how to deal with Saudi Arabia, the Yemen war, and North Africa, where Russia and China are making big inroads.
Mm-hmm.
Sandy?
And not much to add. I agree that Biden is likely to raise the profile of human rights issues and push to bring an end to the war in Yemen, which is a disaster and also has been counterproductive to what I think remains the common thread in U.S.-Saudi relations, which is containing Iran. We've just created a more fertile target for Iran by letting the Saudis free rein against Yemen. I think that the Abraham Accords may actually give us some useful leverage in that the UAE was only prepared to go forward with the normalization with promises from Netanyahu that he wouldn't move ahead on annexation. And I think that's something we'll be able to use going forward if Netanyahu doesn't get removed from office over corruption and tries to inch forward again on annexing some of the West Bank. And I think Biden will try to rebalance our policy and put us back into more of an honest broker role, even if the prospects for real progress are dim. In particular, reestablishing a consulate or mission to the Palestinian Authority in East Jerusalem, but leaving the embassy in Jerusalem, not reversing that decision, but not viewing this as an area where any big breakthroughs are likely in the short term. I agree North Africa is a place where we need to pay more attention. Trump has basically turned his back and let the Russians and the Turks, as well as the Chinese, muck around in Libya, Central African Republic, and many other places. And while we don't want to get directly involved militarily. I think there's more that we could be doing to support the more healthy forces in the region to counter the encroachment by these outside powers.
I just will add a couple of things. What Netanyahu is doing is basically annexing by another name. And that's why I think Biden will have to make a decision on settlement policy, because that has accelerated so dramatically that basically, if you look at the settlement grid on the West Bank and what is planned, it is annexation, because Israeli law is extended to settlements and being extended. And so, it's just a cover story. Formal annexation may be something that radical settlers want, but most of the settlers understand that they're getting what they want without it being called annexation.
Yeah.
Which means that Israel, the problem really lies in Israel domestically, because Israel will be confronted with a majority of Arabs in Greater Israel between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. And that's a problem for Israel, which is a close ally of ours, and for Israeli democracy. So I think that will continue apace. And just one more thing about the Mediterranean, as Sandy was also mentioning, I think we don't look enough at the fact that the Chinese have bought up, leased, and invested in ports all around the Mediterranean. They own Piraeus port, and the Russians now have a major air base and a major military port in Syria, and are hoping to have one in Libya. And the Chinese are investing heavily along both sides of the Suez Canal. So we have a situation with the Mediterranean, which is so essential to our defense thinking and Europe's, is being surrounded by a Chinese-Russian entente, and not enough attention is being paid.
Agreed.
So I want to shift the lens here and pick up on a point that you both made about human rights in the context of Yemen. And one question that we got asked about American credibility on human rights, and asked, what does the Biden administration need to do on racial justice at home to restore credibility on human rights abroad? I think we're all probably expecting a Biden administration to focus on human rights more than a Trump administration did before, which, requires turning the lens inward a little bit. So, what do you see in that connectivity between, important action on racial justice at home and then the promotion of human rights abroad?
I think that the issue of racial justice at home falls more under the umbrella heading of America as a democracy, and whether it presents a model for the world, even with all of its imperfections. Racial justice is in short supply all over the world. So, if you go to China and Russia, the racism is at a level that is sort of like back in Reconstruction era attitudes towards Black people, not to mention ethnic minorities. So if the United States wants to be seen as that model, racial justice is imperative, and of course for many other reasons as well. But America's human rights practice abroad, I think, will be judged not on that, but on whether it does anything. I mean, it's, not what you say, show me what you do abroad. Does it withdraw any American support for the war in Yemen, which is an incredible catastrophe that gets very little attention? And many other human rights issues that are broiling, and the Trump administration has said nothing about. Do we let in more refugees? That is more related to the human rights, watch what we do. Racial justice is more related to democracy. Do we set an example? At least the way I see it.
Yeah, not much to add. I fully agree. I think that there will be charges of hypocrisy until we begin to get our own house in order, and that's not going to be easy with this continued division in our society that this election has revealed. And it's going to look even worse if this contestation of the election goes on, not just for a few more days, but all the way into January, which I hope is not the case. But ultimately, we have to demonstrate that capacity for correcting our mistakes that America has been known for over many centuries, as you know, so we can show a better face and why the American experiment is still working. It's hard to be optimistic that we're going to make early progress on that right now, but I think that's ultimately the answer. And then, as Trudy said, the policies we practice and the degree of consistency when it comes to human rights issues, whether it's in the former Soviet space or with China or in Iran, Saudi Arabia. I think the people will be measuring us by our deeds and policies right from the get-go.
So we're almost out of time. Let me squeeze one last quick question in. So please try to keep your answers brief. And that's about the connection between foreign policy and another thing we haven't spent a lot of time talking about, but which I think will feature prominently, and that is economic policy and trade policy specifically. The Trump administration was notable for its emphasis on increasing tariffs, reversing a trend that had lasted for decades in favor of lower tariffs as part of movements toward globalization. Some Democrats, I think, might be on board with that. Others maybe not. Do you see essentially Trump's trade war ending in a Biden administration, or are we sort of in for more of the same, but maybe with nicer rhetoric?
I think you put your finger on it. Again, Jake Sullivan has written a lot, and this is becoming a mantra for the incoming Biden administration of a foreign policy for the middle class. And central to that is a new trade policy, which sort of spells the end of a neoliberal approach of trade as a good. And much of the Democratic Party had adopted that. And so Democrats are talking openly about trade not always being the answer, and that you have to target tax havens and loopholes from corporations, US, that are benefiting from trade. You have to make sure it doesn't drain jobs. So I don't think we're talking about immediate lifting of taxes that are aimed at a level playing field. I think what you would have less of is taxes that were aimed, tariffs that were aimed for political reasons, for limited benefit, where buy more US soybeans was enough to satisfy the administration. I think it would be aimed more at larger principles. Again, an industrial policy sort of flies in the face of normal trade relations, but the Biden people are saying China does that in a much more intensive way than this incoming administration would advocate. But in competing with China, we have to look more at what they do and how to adapt our policies, including tariffs, to that. So I think that is the way that it will be handled.
Yeah, I think they're going to, not overnight, but rapidly move away from tariffs, which Trump continues to pretend are a burden on China, when in fact the tariffs are paid by American consumers and American companies, and focus more on addressing the structural and institutional and normative issues that we have with China, build a united front, revitalize the appellate body of the WTO, look for reform that can get at the real problems that we have with China, which Trump's trade war haven't addressed, certainly not very effectively, which is their theft of intellectual property, their coercive measures to force the sharing of technology by American companies operating in the Chinese market, these technological threats that they exploit, such as 5G. So I think we'll have a more rational policy. Whether it will be successful, whether we'll even with allies working with us, we can steer China back towards a more constructive international trade policy remains to be seen. But I think that will be the focus.
I would just add one thing. I don't disagree in principle with that. However, and I think working with allies will be critical. But I think what administrations of both parties have found is that China is extremely recalcitrant on changing its structural approach to trade. And even the American business community, which usually would be horrified at tariffs. When I was in China, my last 2 trips last year and the year before, I found them cheering. Not that they really wanted the tariffs, but that they were so fed up that you simply can't break through with China. When one regulation is eased, another one is put in its place. So I think tariffs will still remain as a lever, not perhaps as extensively as used by President Trump, but to apply pressure, which has not been sufficient from WTO rules. So I wouldn't think they're just going to go away.
Well, thank you so much, Sandy and Trudy, for those insights. It's great to have you both again as visiting fellows with us at Perry Worldhouse this year. I feel like we could keep this conversation going, but unfortunately, we're out of time. And thanks everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you next week. We have 2 exciting events. First, defending cyberspace through diplomacy with Estonia's ambassador for cyber diplomacy. And second, a discussion on China's Western horizon, Beijing and the geopolitics, a new geopolitics of Eurasia, a book event with Daniel Markey. More information on those and links to register are in the chat. As always, you can access a recording of this conversation on our YouTube channel. Find out about us by joining our mailing list or follow us on social media at Perry Worldhouse, Instagram, Twitter, etc. We'll drop links to those in the chat as well. And thanks everyone for being here with us today, especially after the wild week we had last week with the election. And I guess we'll see what happens moving forward. And thanks again to Sandy and Trudy for joining us.